Hi guys, welcome to another video. This is Pete from National Videography. Please subscribe, click that subscribe button right now. Look, if you're not gonna do it now, you're never gonna do it. So might as well get it over and done with. Just click the subscribe button and we'll be good to go. Alrighty then, we've got a very exciting show for you today. We're gonna be talking about lab tests, camera lab tests, and can you trust them? There's one group in particular that do a lot of lab tests. They sort of stopped, and I think in 2018 they started to do them again, and that is Cine D. We're going to be borrowing a lot of Cine D's lab test results. So thank you, Cine D. We're using your results for reference purposes, just to do a little bit of a deep dive, to understand what we're finding them, to have a look at the bigger picture, to get them all together and see what we can see, what I saw through all their lab tests that they have done recently with the cameras that we in particular are interested in. So just a little bit about lab tests. What is a lab test? And how is it performed? Now, Cine D, they are more of a prosumer, consumer kind of market-orientated website group, company, wherever they are. Yeah, they also cover all the latest high-end gear. Basically, these lab tests are good because there's different ways of measuring some of these stats in camera stats, and companies are notorious for blowing it out of proportion and sort of giving you a little bit misguided statistics on their cameras, specs on their cameras. So Cine D have sort of dived into that and broke all that apart and really gave us some really great insight into what's happening inside the camera. And in particular, what we're going to look at is their dynamic range tests. And this is where I'm talking about that their tests are a little bit prosumer, consumer, because some of these tests, like the Latitude test, I think is more catered for a camera that you're going to be using with auto settings. And as probably we all know, auto settings can sometimes not give you the most accurate reading, or they could expose for the inside when you want to expose for the outside, or vice versa, like in a big living room or wherever you are filming. And obviously you want to look good, you want to look pro, you want to have a camera that looks pro. So this kind of Latitude allows that prosumer, consumer to then in edit pull that auto setting back or up, depending on where they want to go, to get that perfect exposure for them. So it's important that a camera has decent, what they're saying, latitude, being able to be underexposed or overexposed with that auto setting, so then it can be corrected. For more users, professional users that are relying on manual exposure, this sometimes is a little bit of an odd test, because who under or overexposes that much? Like 5-stop underexposing is heaps, especially if you're considering that you have waveforms in your camera and you're doing this for a living and you're underexposing 5 stops. I mean, you know, it's obviously a good thing to have if you change your mind about how you did it, but that's kind of why we talk about RAW and ISOs and things like that. So that test is a little bit funny, and I think it's reflective. Basically, what they came out and said is that the RAW files perform worse. And look, in Premiere, RAW files, there's like 3 of them. You know, you have to, and there's just so much more information on RAW. And if that was the case, then why would there be ProRes RAW? Why would cameras be implementing still RAW? Why wouldn't we just switch to ProRes if it's such a better codecs, right? As they're kind of presenting it, because oddly enough, in their dynamic range test, ProRes performs better. Like in Blackmagic, it performed better. And I think what's happening is that their test, what they're using to make the test with, is more catered for a camera that is a prosumer, consumer camera that is not using RAW, that is using a codecs, that is already manipulating the image, that is presenting an image that is not a RAW image, that's already an image that's sort of ready to go. Even if it's in a log format, these images are nothing like RAW images. There's a lot of already pre-baked in information that I think their software in particular just performs much better with. And that's why I think ProRes, they find that has like the best performance, because that is like the edge of the Codecs world where it's not raw, but it's kind of behaving like raw, but it still has the statistics, it still has the sort of the build-up of just normal codecs where things are pre-baked. And I think their, especially software, just loves ProRes for that. And it is a great codecs, ProRes, which offers you not like raw sizes and whatnot, but those kind of like raw quality, even though you don't have some control and post over things like the ISO and the color temp. Still, ProRes is a beautiful codecs, and I think their tests definitely show that. But at the same time, they're just showing how raw is a new feature, and that we really need to learn how to use it and how to properly test it. And especially with these cinema cameras, like I want to see more tests dedicated to cinema cameras, more tests that are that give us more insight into things that are important for cinema camera users, and tests that are reflective of those cameras and can separate those cameras better than I think some of the tests that they're doing, like the Latitude test, and let's be honest, like the rolling shutter, which is not really a problem for most cinema cameras, and now with the global shutter is not an issue at all, and I think that test was completely omitted from the Red Komodo. So just to break down their test, how do they do their dynamic range test? So it's really two things. It's the physical transmitted chart that they're filming, and then it's the software that they're using to make sense of those readings. Now for me, I actually just like their transmissive chart and the readings, the waveform readings that they get from that. So let's take a look at what they got with the Komodo. So here is a chart of the Red Komodo. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of these charts. Thank you, Cine D. We've taken them from you guys. We'll put a link to you below. Check out all their tests. Subscribe to them. They're great. They give you this inside knowledge, which I'm going to explain to you how you can see what the camera is doing and sort of like understanding why are we saying this camera is doing denoising? Why is this a camera, we're thinking is just a little bit better or worse than another camera? And we're going to explain to you how these tests give us that insight and really, inform us quite well. So thank you, Cine D, for doing this and providing this information for us. So let's have a look at the Red Komodo chart, which just came out a couple of days ago. So as you can see, everything looks normal, but then let's look at the top part. See how they're basically missing a step. Now, what they have said is that this is highlight recovery, and then our software didn't read this as an actual step because there's no RGB color in it. But the other thing that you have to note is look how low their exposure is. So they're at about 80 there. Most of their tests go up to 90. The Blackmagic goes up to 100. So let's chuck the Blackmagic on. So at first sight, this is the Blackmagic 6K reading that they have. Now they do have an RGB of it, which does show that all the steps that they have numbered have all the colors. But at first glance, we see that, well, it's the same, right? But then no, up the top, you can clearly see that they're missing that first step. And also the fact that Blackmagic goes up to 100, which is like pure white almost, and it's clipping, right? And the first step is at 90, which is like a comfortable exposure for your whites. Because your pure whites can be much higher than your skin tone, right? Because it's white. Did they expose it correctly? Red is notorious for being difficult to expose, right? You have to get that exposure really right, otherwise you could ruin your dynamic range. It's a lot of a harder camera to work with. As you can see, we have this anomaly. Now, this anomaly they're saying is fine because that's not a stop, even though it does move. So it's not clipped, but because it doesn't have all the colors, we're not counting it. Now, celluloid roll-off. If we're going to get into how celluloid works, and maybe we'll do another video on that just to sort of explain that a bit more, but it does have a very gradual roll-off, and as things get brighter, everything kind of becomes white too. And so what's happening there might be something that is a bit more trickier than just highlight recovery. It might be something behind the red dynamic range science and the way that their sensors perform with highlight roll-offs and the reason behind their cinematic look. And so completely discarded as a stop, I think, is false. Even although perhaps to claim it as a definite stop might be a little bit overstatement too, because it is a global shutter. We should be, experiencing some negative impact on that dynamic range, or at least you would think, right? So this could be one of these effects. But what they have done here is I think they've given us a little bit of a misleading characteristic of where red falls in all of the cameras. And they have, like, a day later corrected their Latitude test. And I think there's probably more corrections that they will do in the future to this test or to these tests if they're going to be testing raw video in their lab tests. Actually, there is 13 stops for the Komodo if you use that first stop, because that first stop before the two that have clipped, and the two have clipped is always the same. They've never had the stop that they didn't count, and those two clipped stops at the start is always appeared in all their histogram tests. So, and once we get a little bit more to it, you'll see what I mean, how this looks a lot more like the S1H, the C300, the C500, rather than the Blackmagic 6K, which falls into a different category of cameras that look also the same. You will see that there's a similarity of these histograms, and that perhaps even the red are using a Panasonic sensor because it looks so close to the S1H. So here we have the red Komodo, and this is how I'm telling you that it is similar to the C300, the C500, and the S1H, some of the tests they have done. And you can see all the histograms on the screen here. Now, and you can also look up at CineD. I'm not going to give you all the links. Just look up their website, search for the various cameras. You'll find all the lab tests. Now, you can see that all these histograms look pretty much identical. Apart from the fact that for the red Komodo, they for some reason skipped the first step and started on the second. How come none of the other tests show this up? And how you can see how all the other tests look pretty much the same. It's like they're using the same sensor. This is why I'm saying comparison. It's becoming like, it's good to understand what your camera does, the look it gives you. That's why maybe their tests can be more reflective of the color science, of the different colors you get, the tints you get, that can aid a filmmaker, the saturation of a sensor, in choosing a camera for the specific look of their film. Like, in days of old, we used to choose the celluloid for the look of the film, the saturated film stock, the unsaturated film stock, whatever, the high dynamic range. There's sacrifices that we make for different features, like now with our sensors. So you can see that pretty much if you have the red Komodos, the C300, the C500, or the S1H, you're pretty much going to gain the same dynamic range results. Okay, the red Komodo, obviously there's something funky happening with the light roll-off, but then again, that is the more cinema camera that basically is using RAW and is using secret sauce and all those things, and used to be much more expensive than the Komodo and not really accessible. So we don't really know what's happening there. Is that actually not a stop, or is that a stop? How does it perform on the edit? And I think that's where like the Blackmagic really shines for its users, because these tests are not so reflective of its capabilities, because Blackmagic doesn't do anything with the sensor, right? It doesn't manipulate it like the Sony A7S3. And so these tests might show it to be a little bit worse than the Sony A7S3. But I think users of Blackmagic are finding that they can get same results, and maybe not even better, with their better color science out of that camera through edit, through denoising it, through extending that dynamic range. So now that you can see that these cameras have very similar dynamic range readings by their histograms, let's look at the other set. Oh, and just one last thing. So the FX9, which was like an interesting one. And you can see the FX9 by the histogram actually only shows 12 stops. But you can see how thick that noise floor is. And so obviously there's more stops that are hiding in it. And so this is where it's a little bit complex. Like The histogram obviously shows less dynamic range by the eye, but their software actually reads the FX9 as having even a bigger range. I think it's saying something like 16.8 stop range. We'll get to the software in a little bit, but yeah, and so this is where I think still the Sony colors falls down when it comes to C300 and C500. I mean, if you honestly see C300 light footage, it blows your mind. Like, it rivals Red easily. You know, that light raw and the C300, it's beautiful. FX9, it's good, but it just doesn't have that same richness of saturation. Although the FX6 does look great, it does look very beautiful, but you can see that there's just something going on there with the FXs. Not that I don't like Sony, but that's just something worth pointing out. So first we have the Sony A7S3, then we have the Zcam, and then we have the Blackmagic 6K. And the reason I could see that, right, is you can see that the A7S3 and the Zcam, see how thin that noise floor, the noise floor is the line at the bottom. That's basically the black and how much noise is in the black. So once you denoise it, you're gonna get more dynamic range. And how the Sony A7S3, it is thin, it is tiny thin. And look, their histogram, it's even showing that there is a 13th stop, which is like, there is no 13th stop. That would just get eaten up by noise, right? There's just no point of even showing that because we know that it's being denoised, something that you can do in post. So that's something that sensor doesn't offer you. So that's why the Blackmagic 6K owners are finding that they have the same dynamic range, because as soon as you denoise it, right, and expose it correctly, you're gonna get that 13th stop, maybe even, you know, a little bit more. Because there's a lot of noise there for the Blackmagic, kind of like it was for the FX9, especially if you can see it. So then if you take out that noise stop, that denoise stop of the A7, it's starting to look very similar. And probably the worst out of these would be the Zcam, because it actually also has the denoised floor. See how you can see that it's thinner than the Blackmagic, which doesn't have a denoised floor, but yet it only goes up to 12. So once you know, like if you didn't denoise it, it would be probably like an 11. That's where like the Zcam, it just doesn't perform as well as the Blackmagic. And this shows it, and not only, and this shows it, and the reason that you get pretty nice out of the box images, or at the camera images, is because it's doing more, something that the Blackmagic isn't. So any kind of comparison and stuff like that, you have to account for that it might look better straight up, but then once you push things in the edit, you will see a lot more results with the Blackmagic. And that's, I think, what you will see in RAW. But these Latitude tests don't make sense. RAW is one of these files, one of these formats that you really need to edit it. And more you do a good edit on it, the more you can pull out from it. And so you have to kind of understand that it's not something that's going to give you these, you know, great things out of the box, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to outperform these pre-baked codexes, which we didn't know that before. You know, Canon 5D Mark II, people didn't shoot in C-Log back then. People didn't know that was the reason. I think that's when they started to decontrast their image in camera, and then C-Log came out. You know, we all kind of just shot on just normal formats, you know? So I think it's a discovering process for us all. And so definitely denoise is not a good thing. But you can see how all these cameras pretty much have the same curve. And so it's fair to say that the 6K, the A7S3, or the Zcam will give you roughly similar performance, with the Zcam probably being a little worse, and the Sony and the 6K, at the end of the day, with some editing, probably coming out with very similar looking images. Of course, the A7S3 has a much better rolling shutter, ergonomics, blah, 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 blah. So it is a more usable camera. But if you want straight out image quality with its color science, 6K probably takes it for image quality, just because it also has the same dynamic range. And it just goes to show how good that camera is. And so now we're going to have a look at basically the Red Komodo and the S1H, and the Blackmagic and the Sony A7S3. So straight away we see the Sony's got that denoise, which is like, if we did that to all of them, right, we would get at least a stop out of them all. So And see, the thing is, it's like people say, well, you can turn that off. See, I don't think so, because the sensor is its own computer in its own right. And they want to offload some things from the actual camera, especially when there's a lot of things that the computer camera is doing, the rolling shutter, the things like that, stabilization. So they basically physically wire these things in, like on a motherboard, physically wire these little chips in so that this happens as it's capturing the image, and it's something that just goes through, much like probably the Blackmagic does the dual ISO. They actually physically wire in something on that sensor that gives it that boost. And so that's what's happening with the Sony A7 III. And I've seen the raw footage, the ProRes footage, and it does look like it was sharpened, even though there's some, it was done by a very professional filmmaker and it looks great, but it just sort of had that video-esque feel to it, and that's that sharpening. Look, it's a camera that gives you great out-of-camera footage, and for them, that's not a big deal because you're going to be killing it without, having to do much. Denoising, if you don't have a powerful computer with large codecs, especially like the one that the A7S III, that new one that they're running, it's going to be a nightmare. So they're kind of doing you a favor. But it depends, once you get to that real high-end image quality, they're kind of basically sabotaging their camera rather than helping it. So it's just to show who that camera is more catered for. The Sony A7S III is still catered for more the prosumers and the consumer market rather than like the professional sort of commercial industry users. So, looking at those four histograms, well, the Red Komodo and S1H, if we forget the numbers, we see that they are practically identical. And that's why it gets me thinking, like, are they using something with Panasonic? Because if you think about it, the closest colors I would see to the Komodo are the Panasonics. They're even a little bit more saturated than the Canons. I feel like the Canon's a little bit richer, compared, like a richer video-esque kind of. So I don't know, is there manufacturers of sensor bits that they're cross using, because obviously the Red are also doing in-house sensor work, but that's just a very interesting insight. So the S1H, man, that will definitely pair with your Red cameras, and it is an amazing camera, man. And honestly, if it wasn't for the rolling shutter, it could be one of my damn, that rolling shutter just destroys it. Like, you pretty much can't film in full frame on that camera. You have to film in like crop mode where the rolling shutter becomes more manageable. That's a big problem because movement is life and movement is cinema, and so movement is essential to your filmmaking, and we'll get more on that later. I don't know, that's probably from another video, so you make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss these. Anyway, now we're looking at the Blackmagic 6K and the Sony A7S III, and we see that those curves also look very similar. Obviously, the Sony's has that denoise, and if we compare them together, we see the difference, how both the S1H and the Komodo really have 13 stops before they disappear. Okay, the Komodo, you have to count the one that's not counted, but if we do, and the 6K and the A7 really have 12 stops before they disappear. Yes, we have to forget about the 13th that was given to us by Sony. Thank you, Sony. You make your cameras just too good. There's a couple of readouts from their software, and that's probably where the biggest difference comes from, is that manufacturers will use the whole range. So if that software says that it sees 16 points, regardless of noise level, they will just write 16, or a different noise level, which can be considered unacceptable for professional content. I don't like the software stuff, as I've said before. I've had notoriously bad experience with it using calibrators, and calibrators sort of work similar to what they're doing, where it's testing things physically, and then a software is then making sense of that data for you. And for calibration, obviously calibrating your monitor to perfect whites, and in this case, giving you readouts of various specs of the camera. So I think the histograms show us a lot more insight into what camera falls where, rather than numbers and just digits. we can see that there's definitely a group of cameras that are similar, that have the higher dynamic range, and then a group of cameras that are similar that have a little bit slightly lower dynamic range. And I think if you looked at their more consumer cameras that they've tested, that they will have an even lower dynamic range still, that they'll be kind of grouped together. You have to just beware of human error in all of this. I think it's really good to what we're doing now, to have a look at them all, see the bigger picture and where things stand, and how, you know, why we think one camera probably performs better than the other one, why we are saying one camera is doing something that is a negative for us. And, you know, these tests are so awesome because they give us insight into cameras and they check the manufacturer for us. Because like Zcam, you know, they claim they're doing something that is cinema, only for high-end content creators, yet they're denoising their cinema camera, which is like a big no-no. And, you know, for everybody that is defending the Zcam, well, you know, there you can clearly see that. And I think people that have used it have moved on from it because their experience largely has been that once they put it in the edit, they kind of can't pull the same image quality out of it that they thought they could. And realistically, with all its quirks, it's possibly not. But we're not reviewing Zcam here, but I'm just saying that, you know, it's really checking the manufacturers for us, and it's really showing us, like, if you are out there shopping for like a camera best bang for your buck, you'll see how good the 6K is. And then if you're really concerned about image quality, like, it even kind of outperforms the A7 in my opinion, you know, because with the RAW, with just no camera manipulation, you really just, wow. Or like, you know, how good the S1H is. Like, nobody talks about that camera, but man, you know, it shoots right up there with the C500 and the Komodo, you know, and that's why it's Netflix approved. And anybody that doubts it, you know, but it obviously doesn't have some of the other features. But if you're looking for a quality, you know, camera, the other thing is, like, because camera's such a big decision, because you're not just buying that body, you're buying like the whole system of it, the whole, you know, the lens, the whole, you know, the family of that camera. So it's a huge investment, and it's a long-term investment. So you really want to be informed, and also you want to make best of your cameras. You don't want to find out that there's something the camera is not doing or another camera does better. So make sure you use resources like Cine D to research your cameras and to make sure that you're going to be buying the right camera for you, and to also better understand the equipment that you're using, you know. So with that said, you know, it's an imperfect science, all this stuff. Some stuff is objective, some is subjective. So just remember that, I think, you know, keep a light heart about all this. At the end of the day, it's what you like, and your eye is really the best judge. And we'll just get to that in a second. Just a couple of things. I think the Latitude test is a bit weird. The rolling shutter, it's kind of becoming obsolete. And, you know, if they could really make some changes to cater for more like cinema style cameras and definitely improve on their raw testing abilities, that would be all thumbs up from us, I think. So back to what I was saying, make up your own mind. And remember that the human eye is the best test yet, because your audience are not going to be looking at this through tests, right? They're going to be looking at with these things. So make sure that these things are your guides. And it's just like when you're exposing, just when you're using Vestograms for editing, you always want to have a reference. You always look at your image. You always make sure it looks right. If this was all, it could be done to perfection through tests and labs and scientists, they'd be all doing it. This is why this is an art form, and this is why you're the creator, you're in control of it, and it's what you like. You're steering the ship of your creation, of your project. So have that confidence, stay by your camera. If you love that camera, if you love that look, if that's you, then let nobody else tell you otherwise. So thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this quick little segment. I don't know how quick it was, but the quick turnaround segment. Just wanted to address Cine D's Red Komodo test. Thank you, Cine D, again for doing that test. I'm sure you made a lot of people very happy to see those kind of results about this camera. Hope we see some more. And thank you again for letting me use all your information. I will leave a link to them below. And look, guys, if you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed, I mean, like, what are you doing? Subscribe! All right, I'm out.